Hello and welcome to Psalm a Day. My name is Evan. I'm one of the ministers at St Mary's Anglican Church. And today for Psalm a Day, we're reading Psalm 137. If you haven't read the psalm yet, please stop the video and read the psalm so that we can continue. I'm not going to read it because I'd rather spend the time that I would take to read it just to explain what's happening in the psalm. And so this psalm, Psalm 137, is particularly prickly on first reading. It's actually one of my favourite psalms. And as we go through, I hope I can show you why. I spent a lot of time thinking about this psalm and thinking about the sort of pointed language, not just in this psalm, but all across the Psalter during college. And these particular psalms, unfortunately, because of some of the things that are said and perhaps the way that they are read at face value, a lot of them are excluded from a lot of readings, a lot of litanies, a lot of hymnals across the non-Reformed church. But I would like to show you what this psalm teaches us and why it is scripture and why, just as 2 Timothy 3:15 and 16 says, it is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, preparing God's people for good things. And so we find the psalmist in a terrible, terrible place. And I think for a lot of people watching this video, and particularly for myself, I may never find myself in a situation anywhere near how terrible this is. I have no understanding of how terrible this is. I can look around at some of the cultures around me and can see what it's like to be displaced, can see what it's like to have, I guess, my ancestors before me decimated. But for these things to happen to me, I can't even begin to understand. So that's the direction that I'm coming from. That's the direction that I'm going to start from. And these things, aside from being displaced, despite from having family members murdered in brutal war, and even in unjust actions of war, as we'll come on to see, those things aren't what upset the psalmist. What upsets the psalmist is in verse 3, when their captors, when his or her captors, ask for them to sing the songs of Zion, to sing songs about God and his salvation. And what's happening here is the captors are making fun of God. They're making fun of the great Yahweh, the God of Israel. They're making fun of him, saying, those songs that you sing about God and how great he is, sing them now. Sing them now in our land. Sing them now in front of us, we who have destroyed your land. We have destroyed your cities, destroyed your people, and destroyed your temples. Sing them now. It's incredibly humiliating. But the psalmist doesn't take it personally. What he finds frustrating is that it's the Lord who's being humiliated. And so it's on that basis which the rest of the psalm operates. Unfortunately, this psalm can be misunderstood as a personal cry for vengeance. I don't think any of the psalms, even though a lot of them will use first-person language, or a lot of them will use language which seem very personal, are cries for the Lord to enact a personal vengeance against someone or something. The psalmist is zealous for the Lord. And the psalmist wants God to be vindicated in the eyes of all of the nations. And so here the nations are making fun of Israel, making fun of the God of Israel. And so the psalmist calls Yahweh to stand up for himself. And he makes his oaths in verses 4 through 6. He makes his oaths to remember the glory of Zion, the glory of Jerusalem, even though that it has been destroyed, even though they're in a foreign land. He makes an oath to remember how great God is and how awesome his mighty acts are. And then we get down to verses 7 to 9. And I'm just going to focus on verses 8 and 9. And so here are Here are some really, I guess, jarring words that we find in the Psalter. They're not some of the most jarring words we find in the Bible, because we actually find these words in multiple places in the Bible, because these are acts of war. They're terrible, terrible acts of war. And unfortunately, the Babylonians were known for being terrible in war. But I think there's another level to what's happening here. We find these exact words in Isaiah 13:16, where God promises that when Babylon steps over the line, and when their judgment, when his judgment through them is taken into their hands, and they do it unrighteously, that he will come back and he will punish them because of that. And he uses these words. And so what I think here is the psalmist asking God to do what God has promised to do. He's asking God to stand up and to bring back upon the enemies of Israel, the enemies of God, what God has already promised he will do. And so far, we haven't actually seen anything which is wrong. The psalmist is crying out to God and is trying to uphold the memory of God amongst his people in the face of his tormentors and oppressors. He recognizes that these are people who are enemies of not just his nation, but his God, and are willing to make fun of his God. This isn't a cry of personal vengeance. I don't see any remarks of personal vengeance here. No, the psalmist is asking God, to be who he has promised to be, and to vindicate Israel like he promised to. God is the only one who is able to exact justice perfectly. God is the only one who is able to repay perfectly. The psalmist doesn't hold on to his anger in his heart, and he doesn't hate the people of Babylon in his heart, but he gives that over to God and asks for justice to be done, according to what has been said in his word. There are psalms in the Psalter that exist for every season. And sometimes the season that we're in is so terrible, so destructive, so chaotic, that we can only ask God for justice. We can only ask God to bring justice upon the people who have sinned against him. And we have been taught to forgive because we have been forgiven much. But there is still a place for us to pray that judgment would be brought down, that justice will be done where injustice is, and evil would be put away with. Now, again, the psalmist doesn't make a cry of personal vengeance. He cries out because it's the Lord's name that's being brought through the mud. It's the Lord's people that's being brought through the mud. Will I forgive people for doing harm to me because of who I am? Yes. But if there is injustice going on and people are making fun of the Lord, I can find it in my heart to forgive them, but I can also find it in my heart to ask for justice. I can also find it in my heart for the Lord to do what will glorify him, be turn people to know him or bring justice. And I just want to reflect on the blessed is the one, or happy is the one who repays you for what you have done. Please be under no confusion. This is not a specific person doing things, and it's that person that is happy or blessed. This is not like another tribe or a nation. The person who is happy or who is blessed is the Lord. Please don't be under any illusions. The psalmist is asking God to exact righteousness, to exact judgment, to repay what has been done. And so the one who is happy, even though that God is free to use someone else to bring about that judgment, The psalmist won't pray again after, oh, how good is that person? They brought justice for us. No, the psalmist will always come back to God and say, God, you are righteous. You have exacted justice for us. Because at the end of the day, the Bible wouldn't be the Bible, and God couldn't be God unless he could speak, or unless his word could speak to us in all seasons of life, in every single season, including vast, vast injustice and terrible things happening in war. And so here is a psalm for those of us who have faced the terribleness, faced the awfulness of warfare, and warfare with civilian casualties. Because everything will be paid for. Everything will be paid for. Sin is either paid for at the cross, or it is paid at the day of judgment. Everything is paid for. And through that, God is just. God is glorified. Because there is no thing, just or unjust, which does not go noticed by him. And there is no just action or unjust deed that is not rewarded or punished. That is the beauty of our God. There is nothing that goes unpaid. The psalmist cries out to a God who brings complete justice and brings complete closure to a people who have been destroyed and dismayed. He does it according to his word and according to what he has promised to do. This psalmist knows God and loves God, and so he clings to God's promises to do so. Because why would we cling to a God who does not promise to help his people? Or why would we cling to a God who has not promised to justly exactly what needs to be? And why would we follow a God who does not promise to deal justly with everything that happens? But praise be that our God is not only loving and kind and forgiving, yes, but is also just. Grace and peace to you.